When Clint Eastwood walked into one of the country's most elite film schools, no one expected the Hollywood legend to make an appearance, least of all Professor Daniel Caldwell, a self-proclaimed expert in modern cinema. Confident in his theories, Caldwell saw Clint as nothing more than an outdated relic, a symbol of old-school masculinity that Hollywood had outgrown. So, in front of his students, he tried to tear Clint down, mocking his films, his legacy, his very approach to storytelling. What he didn't know? Clint didn't come to debate. He came to teach a lesson. And by the time the lecture was over, it was Caldwell who got humiliated. The air inside room 214 of Prestige Film Academy was thick with self-importance. A sleek, modern classroom lined with film posters of critically acclaimed indie directors, the space reflected the mindset of its professor, Daniel Caldwell, Ph.D. in film studies and self-proclaimed guardian of real cinema. He stood at the front of the lecture hall, arms folded, a knowing smirk on his face. His students, bright-eyed, eager to impress, hung onto his every word, their notebooks open, laptops glowing. Today's lesson was one he had been waiting to deliver all semester. The end of old-school masculinity, how Clint Eastwood represents a bygone era. He clicked his remote. The projector whirred, flashing an image onto the screen. Clint Eastwood, cigar clenched between his teeth, the iconic glare from the good, the bad, and the ugly. This, Caldwell declared, gesturing to the image, is a relic, a symbol of an era where masculinity was one-dimensional, grunts, violence, and outdated notions of heroism. He scoffed, pacing the room. Tell me, class, how often do we see this kind of protagonist in today's best films? A few students chuckled, others nodded. Today's cinema is more evolved. We've moved beyond the strong, silent type. He clicked again, and Clint's image was replaced by a still from an art house film, a melancholic-looking man staring at the rain. Take this, Caldwell continued, a film about vulnerability, self-exploration, no guns, no vengeance, no outdated power fantasies. This is what storytelling should be. One student in the back whispered to a friend, "Didn't Clint Eastwood win Best Director like multiple times?" Caldwell pretended not to hear. Instead, he launched into his real attack. Eastwood's films, he continued, voice dripping with condescension, are predictable, formulaic, harmful. They reinforce toxic masculinity, the idea that problems are solved with a gun and a stare, that emotions are weakness. Another laugh rippled through the class. The professor thrived on their agreement. This kind of storytelling? Caldwell leaned in, eyes gleaming. It's dead. Hollywood has moved on. He clicked the remote again. The screen went dark. The students clapped. Professor Caldwell smiled. Little did he know his lecture was about to be rewritten. A hand shot up near the middle of the room. It was Daniel Fisher, a sophomore with a deep love for old westerns and war films. He wasn't one to challenge Caldwell. No one was. But something in the professor's speech didn't sit right. "Professor," Daniel asked hesitantly, "isn't Clint Eastwood one of the most successful directors of all time? I mean, Unforgiven won Best Picture, $1 Million Baby too, and Gran Torino." Caldwell waved a hand dismissively before he could finish. "Ah, yes," he sighed, as if exhausted by the question. "He's had success, but let's be honest, his influence is waning. His audience is aging. The industry doesn't cater to his worldview anymore." A few students nodded in agreement. Caldwell smiled, pleased with himself. And then, the classroom door creaked open. At first, no one reacted. They assumed it was another student slipping in late, maybe even the dean checking in. But when the figure stepped into the light, the entire room froze. There, standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes steady as a gunfighter's, was Clint Eastwood. The silence was absolute. A few students gasped. One nearly dropped their laptop. Daniel Caldwell's smug confidence drained from his face in real time. Clint took a step forward, his boots clicking against the polished floor. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just stood there, scanning the room with that same unreadable, unshakable expression that had made grown men rethink their choices for decades. The students looked between their professor and Clint, the weight of the moment sinking in. Caldwell swallowed hard. The man he had just spent 20 minutes tearing apart was standing in his classroom, watching him, waiting. The air had shifted. And Professor Caldwell? He was about to experience something no film school had ever taught him. What happens when you underestimate Clint Eastwood? The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Professor Caldwell's once confident smirk had faded, replaced by something less sure, less in control. Meanwhile, the students whispered among themselves, some nudging their friends, others reaching for their phones. A few already had their cameras rolling. They knew something legendary was about to happen. The dean stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, voice brimming with reverence, "it is my honor to introduce today's guest lecturer, a man whose influence on cinema spans decades, who has not only redefined storytelling, but continues to do so, Mr. Clint Eastwood." A ripple of applause spread through the room, some hesitant, others full of genuine admiration. Clint gave a small nod, his expression unreadable, as he took his place at the front of the class. His presence alone shifted the energy in the room. Where Caldwell had spoken with smug superiority, Clint didn't need to say a word to command attention. But one person wasn't clapping. Caldwell forced a smile, his hands tightening slightly on the podium. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice just a touch strained, "I was just discussing your unique approach to filmmaking." Clint raised an eyebrow, leaning back slightly in his chair, completely at ease. "That right?" he said, his voice steady, unhurried. "Let's hear it." Caldwell hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then he cleared his throat, regaining his composure. "Well," he said, pacing slightly as he gathered his thoughts, "I was explaining to my students how film has evolved, how today's cinema has moved past the old tropes, rugged individualism, violence as a solution, outdated notions of masculinity." He gestured toward Clint with a practiced smile. "You represent an era that was undeniably influential, but, well, let's just say, modern audiences expect more depth." The students exchanged glances. Some nodded along with Caldwell, but others weren't so sure anymore. Clint tilted his head, letting the words settle. Finally he spoke. "That so?" Just 2 words. Yet somehow, the air in the room got heavier. Caldwell shifted. He had expected Clint to be flustered, defensive, maybe even aggressive. Instead, he was waiting, watching, letting Caldwell dig his own grave. Caldwell inhaled deeply, adjusting his posture. He couldn't afford to lose control, not in front of his students. This was still his classroom, his domain. So he did what he always did. He talked. "I think we can all appreciate what you've accomplished," Caldwell began, his tone shifting to that careful mix of condescension and forced politeness. "You've certainly had a long and, shall we say, storied career." Clint didn't react, didn't blink. Caldwell continued. "But as I was telling my students earlier," he said, clasping his hands behind his back, "your films, while culturally significant, are undeniably outdated." He turned to the class, building his case like a prosecutor before a jury. "They glorify violence. They reinforce harmful stereotypes. They present a world where problems are solved with a gun instead of dialogue, with brute force instead of nuance." A few students nodded, some out of genuine belief, others just following their professor's lead. Caldwell took a step forward, emboldened. "And let's be honest, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his smirk returning. "You represent an era that's over. Cinema has evolved beyond your simplistic, black-and-white storytelling." A few chuckles, a couple of approving snaps from the more progressive students in the back. Caldwell smiled. He thought he was winning. But Clint? He was just waiting for his turn. The legendary filmmaker sat there, completely relaxed, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. Then slowly, so slowly, it made everyone lean in, he took a breath, exhaled, and finally spoke. "Professor," Clint said, his voice calm, steady, "you ever actually made a movie?" Silence. Caldwell blinked. "Excuse me?" he said, as if he had misheard. "I asked," Clint said, his gravelly tone never changing, "if you've ever made a movie." The class shifted in their seats. A couple of students exchanged wide-eyed looks. They could feel the shift. Caldwell opened his mouth, then shut it. He let out a small chuckle, as if dismissing the question. "Well, I've studied film extensively," he said, "and I've analyzed—" "That's not what I asked," Clint said, cutting him off without raising his voice. A few students stifled nervous laughter. Caldwell's face flushed slightly, but he quickly composed himself. "Look," he said, forcing another chuckle, "I don't have to be a director to recognize outdated themes." Clint nodded, leaning forward just slightly. "That's funny," he said, voice still measured, "because I don't have to be a professor to recognize a guy who talks a lot but don't know a damn thing about doing." The room erupted. Some students laughed outright. Others tried and failed to keep their expressions neutral. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He had just lost control of the room. And the worst part? Clint wasn't even trying. Clint took a slow breath, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. The classroom was dead silent now, the weight of his presence settling in like an approaching storm. "So," he said, his voice steady, low, but somehow commanding every ear in the room, "what do you consider real storytelling, Professor?" Caldwell perked up at the question. This was his chance to regain control, to steer the discussion back into his domain. He straightened his posture, his smug expression returning like a mask sliding into place. "Well, Mr. Eastwood," he began, his tone deliberately slow, patronizing, "real storytelling is about complexity. It's about nuance. Gone are the days of simplistic good versus evil narratives. Modern audiences expect more than a rugged man solving his problems with violence." He started pacing, his ego inflating with each word. "Postmodern cinema," he continued, "has evolved beyond the need for clear-cut heroes and villains. We now explore the human condition through ambiguity, subverted expectations, deconstruction of traditional tropes." Clint just watched, expression unreadable, letting him talk, letting him dig. Caldwell, lost in his own voice, went further. "The masculine archetype, as you've embodied throughout your career, is a relic. Today we tell stories that challenge those outdated ideals, not reinforce them. We don't need lone gunslingers or war heroes anymore." He finally stopped pacing, turning back toward Clint with a self-satisfied smirk. Clint nodded slowly. Then he asked, "You ever directed a movie, Professor?" The air in the room shifted. Caldwell's smirk froze. What?" "I asked," Clint repeated, calm, measured, but there was something sharp behind his eyes now. "You ever directed a movie?" The students leaned forward in their seats. Caldwell cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Well, no," he admitted, forcing a chuckle, "but I've studied film for years." Clint let out a small chuckle of his own, except his didn't sound forced. He just shook his head, leaned back, and smiled. And the audience? They could feel it happening. Caldwell shifted in place, his shoulders a little tighter, his confidence not quite as bulletproof as it had been 5 minutes ago. The students were watching now, not him, but Clint. Clint didn't gloat, didn't rub it in. He didn't need to. He just exhaled, settling comfortably in his chair, and started talking. "Movies aren't about politics," he said, his voice even, steady. "They're about characters, conflict, and truth." The words hung in the air, simple, but weighted. Caldwell opened his mouth, to argue, to interject, but Clint kept going. The reason people still watch old westerns, war films, action movies, hell, even classic dramas, is because they aren't trying to be smart, they're trying to be honest. He glanced at the students now, addressing them more than Caldwell. They tell stories people can feel, people can see themselves in. That's what film is. That's what it's always been. Caldwell let out a forced laugh, shaking his head. Mr. Eastwood, with all due respect, cinema has changed. Today's audiences don't want simplistic morality tales. Clint cut him off, still calm. No, Hollywood changed, he said. Not audiences. Silence. Caldwell hesitated. The students were locked in now, completely absorbed. Clint let the moment breathe before he continued. You make a movie about a man standing up for what's right, and suddenly he's toxic. You show someone fighting for their family, and you're told it's dated. He shook his head, almost amused. You think heroes don't exist? He asked, his gaze locked on Caldwell now. The professor stiffened. Try telling that to the guy who ran into a burning building to save a stranger, or the soldier who lost a leg so someone else didn't have to. A few students nodded, quietly agreeing. Others shifted in their seats, rethinking things. Caldwell felt it slipping. He had walked into this conversation thinking Clint Eastwood was an easy target, a relic, a washed-up old man. But now he was realizing something terrifying. He was the one out of his depth. Caldwell felt it slipping. The energy of the room had shifted, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't the smartest person in it. He straightened his posture, trying to regain control. He had to say something, anything. But your movies are simplistic, he snapped, his voice just a little too sharp, a little too desperate. Clint didn't even flinch. The world isn't cowboys and villains anymore, Caldwell pressed on, his hands gesturing wildly as if motion alone could hold onto the conversation. It's more complicated than that. We don't live in black and white morality tales, Clint smirked. That same slow, knowing smirk, the kind that had made outlaws think twice before reaching for their pistols. He tilted his head slightly. Funny thing about villains, Professor, he said, voice calm, unbothered. They don't care if you define them. They still exist. The words landed like a hammer, scattered claps. A few students nodded in agreement. Caldwell's mouth opened, then shut. His mind scrambled for a rebuttal, but none came. Clint leaned forward just slightly, like a poker player who already knew he had the winning hand. You can sit in a classroom and debate whether strength, honor, or standing up for what's right is outdated, he continued, but out there, in the real world? He gave a small shrug. There are still people who do bad things, and no amount of modern thinking is going to change that. More students nodded now. The ones who had laughed earlier? They weren't laughing anymore. Caldwell stammered, searching for something, anything to counter with. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had expected Clint to be defensive, apologetic, maybe even out of touch. Instead, he was watching the class turn against him. And the worst part? Clint wasn't even trying. The classroom was dead silent, every pair of eyes locked on Clint Eastwood. Caldwell forced a laugh, though it sounded more nervous than confident. Look, he said, I get it. You have your view of storytelling, and I have mine. Clint tilted his head, considering. Then, instead of arguing, he did something far worse. He told a story. You know, Clint started, his voice slow, measured. I worked with a young director once, fresh out of film school, smart kid, thought he had all the answers. The students leaned in. We were shooting a scene, simple scene, 2 characters, 1 moment, 1 exchange of dialogue. Clint paused, looking around the room. But this guy, he chuckled, he wanted it to be subversive. He wanted layers, complexity. He shook his head. He overcomplicated it, changed the blocking, added a bunch of unnecessary dialogue. By the time we got through the first take, the moment was dead. A few students exchanged glances. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. So I pulled him aside, Clint continued, and I told him, Stop trying to show off how smart you are. Just make the audience feel something." He leaned back in his chair. The next take? We went back to the original version, simple, honest, and it worked. The class sat in stunned silence. Then, from the back, a student raised a hand. Clint nodded. "What's the most important thing you've learned in filmmaking?" the student asked. Clint smirked. Then he turned his gaze back toward Professor Caldwell, locking eyes with him like a sharpshooter, lining up a perfect shot. And in that moment, he delivered the final blow. Never let a guy who's never made a film tell you how to make one. Boom! The room erupted. Cheers, laughter, applause. Some students stood up, clapping. Caldwell's face drained of color. His entire career had been built on theories, on deconstructing great films without ever making one himself. And in one sentence, Clint had just ripped the foundation out from under him. Caldwell opened his mouth, but there was nothing left to say. The students weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Clint. And for the first time in his life, Professor Caldwell wasn't the authority in the room. Caldwell was sinking. His once commanding presence in the classroom had crumbled into dust, and now he stood in the wreckage, scrambling to salvage whatever authority he had left. He forced a weak chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well," he muttered, "art is subjective after all." But no one was buying it, not anymore. The students exchanged glances, some with raised eyebrows, others with barely contained smirks. The ones who had blindly agreed with Caldwell before, they were rethinking everything. Clint simply nodded, as if the conversation wasn't even worth continuing. He had made his point, without breaking a sweat. Then, from the middle of the room, a voice cut through the awkward silence. "You spent the whole class talking about Clint like he didn't know what he was doing." Every head turned. It was Daniel Fisher, the same student who had questioned Caldwell earlier. And now? He wasn't hesitating. "But now," Daniel continued, arms crossed, "it's obvious you're the one who doesn't get it." A murmur rippled through the class. Soft laughter, quiet agreement. Caldwell's jaw tensed. His hands balled into fists at his sides. He had spent years crafting his image as the intellectual superior, the final authority on what was and wasn't real cinema. And now? That illusion had been shattered in under an hour. Caldwell stammered, trying to find something, anything to say. But there were no words that could pull him out of this hole. Because the students weren't looking at him anymore, they were looking at Clint. And Clint? He just stood up, dusted off his jacket, and tipped his hat. No grand speech, no final insult, because winners don't need to gloat. He turned, walking toward the door, his boots clicking against the polished floor. And as he left, the only sound in the room was the door creaking shut behind him. Caldwell was alone, and for the first time in his career, no one cared what he had to say. The moment the door shut, the classroom erupted. Whispers turned into excited chatter, then into full-blown conversations. "Dude, that was brutal. I've never seen someone get humbled like that in real time. I'm dropping this class. This guy's a joke." Some students shook their heads, laughing. Others started packing up their things, realizing they had been paying tuition to learn film theory from a man who just got schooled in his own classroom. Caldwell sank into his chair, staring blankly at the desk in front of him. A man who had built his entire career on tearing others down had just been silenced by the very thing he pretended to understand. He glanced around the room, hoping for a shred of support. But the students weren't looking at him. They were looking at their phones. And that's when he knew this wasn't over. That night, the clips hit the internet before Clint even left the building. At first, it was just a few posts. Then, a flood. Within minutes, it was trending. Clint Eastwood humiliates arrogant professor in his own classroom. Clint Eastwood School's woke film professor on real storytelling. This might be the most embarrassing moment in film school history. Reaction videos, memes, remixes. Someone added dramatic music to Clint's final line. Another edited Caldwell's face onto a game over screen. The internet was merciless. Caldwell's colleagues went silent. Even those who had agreed with his views didn't come to his defense, because no one wanted to be on the losing side of this one. Meanwhile, Clint? He didn't tweet, didn't issue a statement, didn't acknowledge it at all, because for Clint Eastwood, this wasn't a moment. It was just Tuesday. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.